Welcome to Crafted Reality, a podcast by Yellow Brick. In this episode, we chat with our really good friend Hannah McPake, a writer, director and actor originally from Edinburgh but now based in Cardiff. We talk about lots of different things from theatre, non-traditional theatre, devising, R&D, making work and everything in between. We hope you enjoy. Here we are in the office with Hannah McPake. Welcome.
Thank you.
So this is our third episode on Crafted Reality, yay. And Hannah's with us to just have a chat about stuff that you do and a project that we collaborated on a couple of years ago called Rise, which merged into a project called Dyad. But yeah, tell us a little bit about what you do, Hannah McPake.
Wow, okay, thanks.
Big question there at the top of the chat.
Yeah, what do I do? I think I wear various hats now. I started out as an actor, which is, of course, how we know each other. We both trained as actors at Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama. And I still work as an actor. That's a kind of big part of what I do, but I also make work. I've done some directing, and I guess specifically devising directing, where you make the piece in the room. You don't start with a script, and I also write.
What was the transition between you performing to writing? Maybe talk a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'd been an actor for about 10 years, and again had been working a lot with companies who devised, improvised, made work in rooms, and that tended to be the work that I enjoyed most, where it felt like you were using your brain, you were creating stuff, there was some level of agency there. I'd also been doing a lot of actor-musician work, and I started with Lucy Rivers. We began to feel like there was a kind of work that was lacking. There was Lucy is a musician, writer, performer, and she played in a lot of bands, and I think we were quite excited about the idea of beginning to make some actor musician work that felt more like going to see a gig, going to see a band. So we were kind of excited, one, by making our own work, kind of taking charge of that process, and two, making something that felt a bit cooler and edgier than a lot of the work we were seeing out there, that maybe felt more like going to a gig, going for a night out and turning up at a theatre and sitting quietly and kind of watching something that the audience had a slightly more active, engaged role. So I guess we began exploring that. We made a show called The Bloody Ballad that was a kind of gig theatre-y, schlocky, Tarantino, Grease meets Scream was one of the ways it was described in reviews. Show, and we took it up to the Edinburgh Fringe, and we're very lucky that it won lots of awards and was a success. And then from there we went, oh, okay, there's an appetite for this, and we began to then just make lots of other work. Our next piece pushed in a different direction. We made it site-specific in the Norwegian church, so it was still had the gig elements, it still had people turning up for a night out, but this time they perhaps also thought they were coming to a medium evening rather than necessarily a piece of theatre, and we definitely had people turn up who genuinely thought they were coming to see mediums. And we used the whole space. Scenes took place in the main body of the Norwegian church. They also took place outside the windows, up on the ceiling. So again, we just were pushing at kind of what that audience experience was. And I guess maybe that's kind of where and why we found a crossover in what we do, I think. So that's a very long ramble to your question. But yeah, I think it was about having agency in the work, about making work that we weren't necessarily seeing, particularly in Wales, and then really considering audience experience and pushing what that was and exploring what that could be.
And it's really interesting when you're talking about when you introduce yourself about you make work that doesn't necessarily start with a script.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that sounds terrifying equal to it being really quite exciting. So in terms of where you start with that process, where do you start?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, like, that, yeah, that's definitely, I would say, what I did. And I think kind of as I've developed my writing skills, I'm not sure that that's a fair reflection of what I do now. But yeah, what I really loved was turning up in a room. And I guess often I was turning up in a room, those rooms as an actor, where you definitely feel like there perhaps isn't a plan. What I then know from leading those rooms is there's probably more of a plan than you're letting on. But you're starting off with like a big idea, something you want to interrogate, a question you want to explore. So, for example, one of the devised pieces I worked on was with Told by an Idiot, which was about the last man hanged for blasphemy. It was called I Am Thomas, about Thomas Aikenhead, who was, the last man hung for blasphemy in Scotland in, I can't remember the year, maybe 1607, that's wrong, something like that. But they wanted to explore this show, which essentially is about... what you can and can't say, about religion, about freedom of expression. They wanted to explore it through football punditry and kind of 70s rock music. So they had some songs that were written, but they had no idea what the texture around those songs would be. And so you go in a room and you improvise and make stuff up, and you generate and you generate and you generate. And a lot of that stuff will get chucked away, but those little gems will be kept. And I think that's what I found really exciting, was it's really active. You go in and you just start making, and there's no pressure for it to be good, for it to be right, for it to even be interesting at that initial stage. You just go in and generate. And through that generating, you discover what the show's about. You discover the gems that you want to hold on to. But yeah, it can be terrifying, because quite often the show doesn't reveal itself until like week 3, week 4 rehearsals, even tech. Which I find very exciting, but I think can also probably be terrifying, particularly for the people who are producing those shows.
Well, I guess on that, have they decided that it is a show?
Yeah.
If you see what I mean. So they've identified the output.
Yeah, I guess the form is known because you have to market it, right? Yeah. So there are lots of knowns. So you're not turning up with nothing. That's kind of a myth. You're turning up with a lot of knowns. But within that, there's a lot of freedom in terms of what direction it can actually go in and what form it will take. I guess kind of like a good example of that in some ways, Ali, is the first project we worked on together with Mess Up the Mess.
Yeah, that's true. So Mess Up the Mess are a company based in Ammanford who work with young people. And I think this was perhaps one of the times that we had sort of reconnected. So we had been to drama school together, but you were in the year 3 year, was it performance? I don't know what the name of the course was.
BA Acting.
BA Acting, there it is. And I was on the postgraduate acting. So we sort of had met there because we did... a kind of end of year show together, which we won't mention exactly what that was. Let's just say it was an interesting show.
Yeah.
And then we sort of lost touch, I think, over quite a few years. I stayed in Cardiff. You kind of travelled around the country. Were you in London for a little bit, I think?
I was working abroad a lot for a really big chunk of that. I did a lot of touring abroad.
Yeah, and then we sort of then on this project that came together where we essentially had a couple of weekends and then a block of 2 weeks to produce a show with the young people from Mess Up the Mess. And you're right, I think that we didn't really necessarily have a storyline at that point. We had some themes that came from workshops, that came from the young people, and it was up to us, and we worked with a writer called Heaven Robinson to try and craft and shape then everything that happened thereafter. And I suppose, as you said, again, it was very much about playing within the space and giving the young people opportunity to be able to collaborate with us. And I suppose one of the briefs for us was it was very much had to be a piece from their own kind of creativity rather than us sort of very much leading on it's going to be this and these are the decisions that we've made. So you're right, I think a lot of the things that we did there allowed that space in that room for the young people to have a voice within the creation of the piece, and then it was sort of our job really to sort of almost put those pieces together into something that was more of a maybe more of a kind of traditional theatre piece. I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, interesting, because you would say that was traditional. I think that for me felt like it was, it included loads of things. There were definitely elements of theatre, there was a story, but there were huge moments of interactivity. So yeah, we had this kind of 10 days, I think, altogether to create a piece with young people, and they identified some big themes that meant essentially we were going to make a piece about going to space, or realising they were on a spaceship going to Mars and they had been sent away because planet Earth didn't think they were of any value. And so there was a big decision point within the piece for the audience to decide with the crew, the young people, whether they were going to go on into the unknown or whether they were going to turn around and go back. So there was a story, there was some theatre, drama, but there was interactivity, and we had the audience in role as kind of other passengers on this ship. So yeah, traditional, I would say, in some ways, but also I think bridging that gap in terms of what you guys do, and then kind of, I think, the work that I had been making. So that definitely felt like the beginning of those worlds kind of coming together.
The reason I asked about the process is it kind of feels very similar to, I guess, stuff that we've introduced into Yellow Brick, but stuff that's really come back from design thinking and user-centered design, and this difference between two things. So human-centered design being this, we kind of know a problem, but we don't know an output, deciding on an output, and then you're moving towards this user-centered design bit, which is when you know the output, and then you're working with the people to create the response or the output itself. So just kind of interesting synergies between the two. And I guess it's the way you're facilitating that's kind of interesting, I think. And whether it'd be really interesting to see how similar they are or dissimilar they are to design, I think, like in the future.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's one of the things that I've learned massively from working with Yellow Brick, and then I guess doing kind of other similar bits and bobs around the edges, is the value placed on research and development, and actually that research and the development starting from a point of not knowing, starting with provocation, but really being a genuine exploration of both research and then developing that, because I think that term can be used in theatre a lot, when actually a lot is known. You might have the script, you might have a lot more factors will be in place. So yeah, I think there definitely is a difference in terms of how those words or that period of exploration is used.
Yeah, and I think, again, in terms of when we started Yellow Brick, that became also for us, or for me maybe, because I'm not from a design background, that idea of that period of time where you can totally absorb yourself in a theme or a topic, or even if it's just a word or an emotion, exploring all of those facets and not necessarily having any preconceptions about any of it, because it's not just your opinion of that. It's, what does somebody else think about that, or what could that mean in another situation? And I think, that research and development time has very much become part of our process as an organisation, where we do allow, no matter what we're working on, whether it's a project for other people or we're working in collaboration with somebody else, finding out everything we possibly can about this thing of what it could be is kind of really, really important. And I think often with some projects, you don't necessarily have that grace of that time. You kind of just maybe skip that and then jump into, it's going to be sort of this sort of thing, and there's no other way it can be. Whereas the research and development sometimes does often change your mind about something quite radically, and then it ends up then changing the whole project to something you'd never imagine it to be. Because the topic has led you somewhere, or even the people that you're collaborating with within that space or over that period of time just kind of shine new light on it, and it suddenly becomes something totally different that you could never imagine. And I think that's really, really exciting.
It's interesting thinking about that in terms of like writing, which I think is probably what I'm doing more now. Is I'm not sure that I officially call that part of the kind of dreaming time I don't factor that necessarily into part of the process, either in terms of how it's equated financially or how I think about it. I think a lot of that work happens. You watch things, you read things, you go for walks and stuff percolates in your head, but I'm not sure that I would articulate that necessarily as part of my writing process. I would probably count that really from the point of time that I sit down and begin trying to get stuff down on a piece of paper. And it's absolutely, like you say, the point where decisions are made, exploration, discoveries are made. So yeah, that's interesting in terms of how we articulate and think about that time.
Kind of feels like maybe a question we'll get to a bit later on as well, where there's two bits that you've kind of we're going to constantly come back to, I guess, and one of them is content versus technology. So, story first, and then you add technology, and I'm saying that as a question, not necessarily as a statement. But then, and that already is making a decision, right? So in a sense, going back to that kind of the play, you've made a decision that the play is the best vehicle to share this story. And obviously that might not be the case, but the ability for you to then, like you say, move outside of that, because you could imagine a project where you go, I know this is not the best way I could make my kind of statement, if you like, the way I kind of want to talk. And I guess there's an element of frustration that we've had where we are sometimes in projects where you just know the best vehicle isn't necessarily the vehicle that you're on, if that makes sense. Yeah. And it's kind of almost like due diligence as well. And I think due diligence in the sense of, if we're talking about user-centered design specifically, and therefore co-production work, if your co-producers are technically your audience and they're telling you one thing, then I'd probably say the people with the money that are backing these projects should really kind of start thinking along the lines of, well, these are telling us what they want, and kind of not ignore that, not just carry on with, we're just going to make a show. Right, if they're that has to, and I guess I'm maybe being quite specific, or trying to be quite specific in terms of the idea that a show with bums on seats in a theatre. It's up to them then, I think, to find out, okay, well, we're not going to do it in a theatre, we're going to do this, but how are we going to make money? I don't know. Interesting kind of conversation about, we get into the realms of venues and all that kind of stuff, but like how they react, interact, change, alter. Because there's thousands of people online willing to consume a lot of content daily, and we're still making them make what could be up to 3-hour journey on a train or something to put their bum on a seat. And I understand live, but just kind of interested in chatting about that bit as well.
Oh, you've opened a can of worms there, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's loads of things to look at within that. So one is just, I guess, commissioning processes. So work will often be commissioned for a specific venue, so it has to take place in that venue. And I guess venues are the things that are funded, right? Yes, so I guess there's that. And in some ways those restrictions as a creative are useful. I don't know, an example of that being asked to write a Christmas show for a venue. You know that your show will go on at this time of year. It needs to be this kind of title to sell to this audience at that time, and it will take place in this venue. And those restrictions, I think restrictions are always quite useful because they can then allow freedom within what that is, but that's a very specific example. But I guess that is a place where theatres make a lot of money, so they're not going to compromise on those.
And just building on that, I guess that also for audiences becomes a kind of ritual, in terms of something that families might do every year, or young people might want to do with school trips.
You can say the word, it's panto.
Well, panto, Christmas shows, I think there's a whole variety of things on offer in venues at that time of year now. So I think commissioning is one of the reasons, and that commissioning happens because of venues' funding streams. So funding for us, Arts Council of Wales, but Arts Council of England, Creative Scotland, and what the stipulations of those funding bodies are. But I think people are open to all kinds of experiences, like you say, and I think that live thing will still make people travel. I don't know, I'm just trying to think, like, everybody I've spoken to at the moment is going to the ABBA thing in London, right? Like, and the most unlikely people, everybody I speak to is going to that ABBA event. And I guess there's an element of live there, but also it's not as well, you know? So that's interesting. And then, I don't know, thinking back to other work I've made, I work a lot with Wildworks, who are based down in Cornwall. I made a big show with them 2 summers ago, and that had hundreds of people every night on a beach in Cornwall, travelling miles to come and watch something, but also then engaging other people who were just on that beach because they happened to have gone there in the day and were around the edges. So there's something, I think live can mean lots of different things, and I think this is the territory that we've talked around a lot, isn't it? And coming at it from slightly different viewpoints.
Yeah, I guess for us, I mean, it's kind of like the work we've always made has never had a venue. So other than but it has had locations.
And I think coming back to when I described Mess Up the Messes piece as traditional, I think because I was thinking it's in one location. Well, that's my pen, sorry. It's in one location and it's in a building.
Yeah.
And then maybe my mindset is, okay, well, that's sort of still theatre for me.
Yeah.
In my mind, potentially. Whereas maybe I'm sort of thinking in terms of like non-traditionally, because we've made a lot of stuff outdoors, that really separates, begins to maybe separate theatre a little bit more for me in terms of that's where we kind of that's where we made street games, and the element then of moving from space to space to space. And I know there's kind of promenade theatre and all of that, but I guess, the cityscape or other spaces or non-traditional buildings or spaces where we would usually perhaps sit and watch theatre, maybe that's, space for me maybe plays a big thing in how I think about, what's theatre and what's not theatre, potentially. I mean, it's very grey, you know.
Yeah, and I think we all, like we sit on different spectrums for that. So the reason I would say it felt less traditional was the level of audience agency and interaction within it.
Yeah.
They were really active, were asked to make decisions, audience action stopped while people took part in games or voted on things.
Yeah.
So again, it's just how you look at it, isn't it? I think, and although it was within a theatre space, we had created a kind of site within that theatre, so the audience were not sat in a seating bank watching something. They were in I guess what almost looked like a cabaret setup, loads of tables, and audience were sat in kind of pods around each table. Yeah, so often it comes down to the language we use to describe things, and that being slightly different or meaning different things, which is interesting.
From that project, we had started having further conversations about, I guess, ways in which we could find to work together, really. And I suppose one of the first pieces that we had created together was
Final Cut.
Oh my
right
gosh.
On the cusp of going into lockdown. So we'd done a few things. I think I came in then did some acting work for you. I voiced Extinct.
Yes, you did.
Which was a interactive walk through the centre of Cardiff, using voice responsive technology. Is that correct?
I mean, it was very smoke and mirrors, but thank you for elevating that project for us. Yes. It was kind of a part street game, part audio experience. So we'd done that, and then we had worked on an interactive dining experience, you're right, just before COVID happened. And that was very much about creating a piece that people could either decide to just watch and allow things to happen around them, or if they wanted to, they could be very much part of the action of that. And that was something we made for the WMC, which is a large theatre space based in Cardiff. And you directed that for us and co-wrote some of that content, again with Heaven Robinson, who we worked with on Nowhere. I guess that's where we all sort of converged, didn't we, as almost like a little cohort from that point.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was one of those like devising kind of processes, even though we did have bits of we had a script in the end, but we started with kind of some restrictions that we knew WMC wanted us to create a piece for their Fresh Bar, which is a kind of cabaret dining space. They quite often had things like Fawlty Towers dining experience in there, and they wanted something new, so we had to create a murder mystery that took place around a meal. So you're factoring in cooking times, it's all quite mathematical and kind of has to be really precise. They also wanted something that had a kind of 80s vibe. There were a few other things that they wanted as well. I felt like we had like 5, a film set. It had to feel like it took place in a film set. And was there something else? That's 4. Anyway, that's quite a lot.
I guess the time, just the overall time, it had to end at a certain time to allow then guests to have their final drinks and then sort of leave for the evening.
Yeah. So although we had some freedom within that, we were having to devise something that quite mathematically hit a lot of briefs. So we ended up creating this piece called Final Cut, where people turned up to be extras, essentially on a film set that was a restaurant setting, and fortunately how handy,
by happenstance,
in the 80s themes, so they could turn up wearing their best kind of
attire.
80s attire, exactly. And then we had makeup artists and people pretending to be crew to kind of shush them up a bit, give them a bit of glitter and a back comb, and and then they turned up for filming. The kind of main actors would turn up and be introduced, and the director was there shouting at everyone, telling people what to do. But over the course of the evening, people were murdered, and so it became a kind of puzzle of trying to solve who had committed these murders, alongside eating your dinner. And in fact, what we did was we kind of shoehorned some politics in there as well, because really we ended up creating a piece around consumption and how willing we are to just keep consuming and consuming and consuming, why we love watching people being murdered while we eat our dinners at home, why 9 o'clock murder series are so popular on TV. Yes, we'd made that, and we were making that really just as we were beginning to go into lockdown. So it was kind of quite an interesting time, and a piece that I think potentially had a lot more life in it, but unfortunately was cut short, as a lot of things were by the world shifting and changing.
I mean, the irony of the name.
Yeah.
It's the final cut for not only the story, but also for ourselves.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask in relation to the project that you had done in the Norwegian church, that seance, it's quite interesting that you had said that some of the audience actually really did think they were going to come to a seance rather than a theatre piece. So in terms of what was the invitation to the audience for that show?
Yeah, so the marketing was, the show was called The Forsyth Sisters, so all the marketing was called, had the Forsyth Sisters on it. And I wish I could remember the wording. So it was something like you were invited for a cup of tea and a visit from beyond the grave. So the language was relatively tongue-in-cheek. I think there was a blurb on the back which described kind of the Forsyth Sisters, what they did, which was kind of contact the dead, and then some kind of big questions like, what happens after death? Can dogs really see orbs? So the tone was quite daft and silly, and there was a picture of me and Lucy Rivers in some very bad wigs on the front. So I think if you looked at that, there was definitely, we had thought there was enough within the flyer which, made it clear it was a theatre show. I think there were also probably bits of reviews for Bloody Ballad and Stars on there, and, funded by the Arts Council of Wales, all that stuff. But I think if you're just looking at a list of what's on in the Norwegian church without that full flyer, without that, then perhaps maybe you do think it's a evening with some real mediums. Now, on the whole, it went really, really well. There was one experience which wasn't so great and people were upset. And I think, to also be clear, we weren't wanting to take the piss out of that, out of mediums or people who do that. We were just kind of creating a theatrical experience which which was entertainment. It's interesting because we said we didn't want to take the piss, but I can see that perhaps, as with everything, if you veer into territories that people take very seriously, then they are going to be upset.
Did you, on that though, did you ever, were you ever looking, not necessarily to trick them, but for people to immerse themselves in the world? Did you ever feel that, by the sounds of things you didn't, but did you ever think someone would think this could potentially be real?
Yeah.
You did?
And so we had Katie Owen greet you upon arrival. Katie's an actor and she was pretending to be from the Harbour Authority, so she was there as Di, who ran the church. So everything was within, from the moment you arrived on site, you were within that world. Now, there were also big lighting stands everywhere, a soundboard, a stage management, So again, it's really interesting looking back on it. I think we felt it was very clear that it was a theatrical offering, but with an immersive element. But I can also see that if you were viewing that with a different lens, then you might have expected something else. But no, it was immersive. It was completely immersive. And then we conjured kind of Johnny Cage from Johnny Cage in the Voodoo Groove, who was essentially death coming to take people away. And it was like a dirty rock blues gig.
And I guess this is kind of a similar experience that we've had initially working with the idea of agency within work. So, how much agency, meaning how much kind of access or permission do you give people who take part to become players as opposed to audience, and the weird power of providing agency, even if you didn't feel like you did give agency, is kind of interesting, isn't it? And we found that to our detriment sometimes, and also it's kind of been negative, and it's also been positive in terms of people providing story that wasn't created, because it's they've co-created the story with themselves, with us, and so on. But then there's also this, I guess what we're getting to is there's also this thing that we learned, maybe we were a bit naive, but we'd learned that, it's a Spider-Man quote really, with great responsibility.
Yeah.
You kind of have to look after your players.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just don't quite realise the power of the thing you've made.
Yeah, and I think probably because the Forsyth Sisters, for us, Gagglebabble, that was the closest thing we've made in some ways to the type of work you made. It was immersive. It was in a space that people knew for having gigs and events like that. We did invite an element of agency. The whole beginning section was really interactive with the audience playing games and people standing up and giving stories, and we had audience plants, and for the most part that interaction was really joyful, and we had a story, we had a narrative, we had a frame that we stuck to, but we had allowed space within that for some flex. Of course, there was one night in particular, I'm thinking we had a very rowdy group in who really pushed that to its limits, but they were also having a great time and had really bought into the world. So yeah, I know this is something we've talked about a lot in terms of when we've been to see work or work that we're making. And again, I think Final Cut is a prime example of that, the interactive dining experience we made for WMC. We allowed audience agency, and sometimes they really challenged what we had anticipated they might do within that, in both a good and not so great way when it involved, kicking a dead actor on the floor kind of thing. So it's really... Yeah, it's a really interesting boundary. You want people to play and feel engaged and immersed in the world, but you also have to consider that people will behave in ways that are above and beyond what you imagine they will do.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying about the Gagababel show in the Norwegian church, sort of when those traditional theatre cues are no longer there, you don't sit down, the lights are on, and then the lights go down, and then you know something has started. Whereas, as you were saying, you had an actor at the door who was playing somebody from the Harbour Authority. Are they from the Harbour Authority? They probably are. They sort of look like they're from the Harbour Authority. They'd be in the right place potentially, you know. So it's sort of the lines between reality and fiction become really quite blurred, isn't it? And sort of when does the piece start? Yeah. Has it started? And you know, with that as an audience member, that can be kind of quite exciting, or for people that perhaps are seeing or experiencing that for the first time, could be kind of quite confusing, or they're just buying into, oh well, this must be real because, and the show hasn't started yet. So I think that's sort of also kind of quite interesting as to when and how do you know things have started or even ended. And I think we had the same issue with one of our games called Reverie. I'm just remembering this now, which was a street game based in Cardiff. There was 12 locations. The audience was split, or the players were split into groups of 6, and you could go around these locations in any order that you wanted to, and you had basically an hour and a half to do so. And we, towards the end, would basically bring everybody together. So all of the audience had to come together for this final sort of scene at the Wales Millennium Centre, and this was in their sort of loft space, this amazing kind of cavity that sort of sits just almost above their main theatre. So everybody kind of converged there, and we sort of felt that end scene gave everything and sort of resolved everything within the street game that they'd taken part in for that hour and a half. We kind of felt there was an absolute resolution. There was a very much definite line drawn underneath the thing. But then what we discovered when everybody left, there was this one group of players that were that I was part of, because I was kind of playing along that night, who were convinced it was not over. They were like, this has not finished. This is definitely not the end of the story. We've got to go back to the first location and basically see if the main protagonist of this street game, the person that they were trying to find, may be still there. And I sort of said to them, because they didn't know I was involved in any way, I said, I don't think that's the case. I think that is it. And we'd even, through the game, I'd sent a text message to say, out of world, thank you very much for playing Reverie. We hope you have a very good evening, you know, good night. So to absolutely. But they just wouldn't listen, and they were like, no, we're going to go back. So they went back to the first location, and they kind of just were there for about half an hour, wandering around, just absolutely convinced that this was almost just the beginning of the story after an hour and a half. Right. And they came back to the pub because we'd invited everybody back to a local pub just to kind of have a chat. And they were like, oh yeah, it had ended, hadn't it? But it's sort of that power of, I guess, that storytelling, and again, that immersion and that sense of, you know, really wanting to have more, which was, you know, really quite flattering, really, in terms of that project for us, that, you know, people did find it interesting, you know, really wanted to have more of that content, to take it even further. And it's again, how do you end or even begin those things, again, with that sort of duty of care that you were talking about, of being really clear, okay, so this is where it has began and this is absolutely where it ends. And almost, I guess, within the structure of those things, and we always say this, you know, the real world still exists, even though we've mapped an external reality of it. Everything else, you know, is real. If I walk across the road and I don't look left and right, and I'm not aware of my surroundings, I might get, you know, run over. So you've got to be aware that you don't become a superhero in those situations just because you're playing a game or you're part of a story. The thing with the final cut that you were saying, you know, people kind of maybe getting a little bit too carried away and sort of forgetting consequence. Yeah. of their actions or even of what they say within that space.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. That agency thing is so interesting. And remembering these projects, and it's kind of thinking back to that time, which I guess we're talking about like early 2010, 11, 12, 13 in Cardiff, kind of the theatre scene and people making that kind of work. It makes me think about Give It a Name, and those type of projects, which I think were also part of that landscape of, I would say you guys kind of on the side of making it from a game perspective, and then people like Give It a Name making it from a theatre site located lens. And then we were kind of on a gig, but also pushing what that could be and what that could mean. So there was definitely around that time kind of people really pushing where theatre took place, what it was, what it looked like, who took part in it. That's just interesting to remember, because I think those Give It a Name pieces bridge some of the gap between kind of the work we were making, the work you were making, and also invited that audience interaction. So they made three shows around that time: Heart of Darkness, My Life in CIA, and then Rude. All of which, were kind of site located and were an invitation to an audience to go on a journey.
And I guess the big one being National Theatre Wales literally launched at that time, around that time, pretty much everything, and they launched their 13 shows, and I think 3 were in venues.
It was something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so everything else was very much, and their conversation was very much about, this is our pie, if you like, of theatre. So like each slice being a version or an edge of theatre that we believe in. So it was a very interesting time, at a time when Cardiff itself as well was going through some massive developments, very similar to now. I can't quite get over the similarity to now, but in terms of the skyline, huge developments. Again, loads of empty shops, kind of austerity 1.0, and we're in like 2.0 now. So it's kind of really interesting time, whether that, and I guess technology not being great. And what I mean by that is we're not in Pokemon Go territory yet. We've got smartphones, but they're not that smart. So we kind of have to, and still do, we have to physically create work that's immersive, and we physically have to tell people where to go and give them a map. You mean that kind of thing, really. Just if in terms of budget, I mean, if you had loads of money, you probably could do it. But I think, I guess what I'm saying, it seems like there was a lot of elements that came together at one point that described it. Because Yellow Brick was very much from a social design thing initially, wasn't it? And then we went, there's a load of private land. Why is there so much private land? Why can't we play in this private land? Or why can't we just play in public? And obviously then it kind of rolls off from there. So it's kind of interesting how everyone had an itch, and they responded to that itch in very different ways.
And I think it's that thing of like, where can stories take place? Where can theatre happen? Seemed like with NTW launching during that time, that seemed to be like one of their provocations. Theatre can take place anywhere. It doesn't have to be contained within a building, and we don't have to necessarily think about audiences again being seated. They can be part of the action in a sense of moving from space to space, or they could be seated on a beach, or all of those kind of things that we were looking at in terms of street games, of where interaction could take place between public and private space. And then equally in terms of the stuff that you were doing, where can we tell our stories, and how can we do that in really interesting and different ways.
And then who engages with them because you're telling them in different ways. I think that's the thing that we were definitely interested in, was exploding out the audience and going, what if you can get people who will come to a gig but wouldn't come to a theatre? What happens if you begin to engage with different groups of people? How does that impact the stories and the work that you're making? And then it's interesting because if I kind of look at the trajectory of Gaggle Babble, in some ways I think we probably got more traditional as we went on, but definitely those early shows were really, I think, exploratory in terms of kind of the form and the ambition to engage with younger, different audiences.
It's kind of interesting thinking about the National Theatre Wales thing slightly. It's also like, if you think of every single one was a partnership, but not necessarily with a venue. And from memory, I mean, I'd have to go through them all, but I'd say at least 50% of them were partnerships with people that weren't theatre makers, if you think about it. So like The Beach was hide and seek. We had No Fit State Circus. So it also kind of, in the realms of Gaggle Babble, and it's kind of, the subject matter or the partnership also brings a new audience to theatre, and equally the reverse. So I think at that time, going back to your point with regards to art being kind of like, it doesn't have to be in a venue. And also, we might be making theatre, as in a question, like, we're theatre makers. I never thought about it like that. Like there's this interesting thing of like, we could expand our audience, or we could like make stuff for people when they might be interested. And I feel that's kind of interesting that it genuinely was that kind of mix. Obviously it's gone on to being something that has then kind of been seen as a negative more recently, where traditional writers haven't been involved and so on. But it's kind of I think for us at that time, it was very eye-opening that someone a designer, could actually to go in and kind of make some content, and people go, that's kind of theatre, that. You're an artist. And I thought that was quite interesting. And then we'd be in an empty shop, and we'd be doing something with Matilde in Assembly, which was a outreach of National Theatre Wales's projects, and you're like, this is going back to the stuff before, this is a lot like a user-centered design workshop. This is weird, and it's just the output that's different, right? Or the response that's different.
And the language around it, that's kind of the interesting thing. I think quite often we're talking about the same things or doing the same things even, but talking about it totally differently. And I guess that's where I'm really interested in, because your work crosses over. So it's, in some ways you do make theatre, but you make things for all kinds of other audiences, other landscapes, you'll kind of crossover into, I guess, work for heritage or work for businesses. Like it's that same storytelling, audience-driven work, but with a different lens on it. And I find that really fascinating.
We specifically, I think, and remember wanting to try and see if we could make an art company that was sustainable. And we did try and have continued to try to split Yellow Brick in two. One doing commercial work and one doing artistic work. Now that's not to say there's not artistic work in the commercial and commercial work in the artistic, but fundamentally the idea of getting paid to make own work. And I think we will talk about Everwake and stuff like that in a future episode, but Everwake was done on 3K, and that was our holiday money for that year. Like, no one paid us money for that. They paid some money towards a festival that we did at the same time, but Everwake was purely done on favours, volunteers, and our money. We just, like I said, we just didn't go on holiday. Probably not just for that 1 year, probably for a few years afterwards as well. And I think that was kind of the challenge as well, because I think that was more coming from my perspective and background. I wanted to make something that was trying to change or look at a different way of working for people. I don't think we've necessarily been as successful as we'd have liked in that respect, but we're still here. So it can't have been that bad. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel that's kind of quite important. Because we've had relatively little funding over the years. I think we've had 3 or 4 Arts Council of Wales bits of money in 13 years. You know, which is quite a difference to people will be doing like every year 2 or 3 parts. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's kind of just something to say, just something to mention, that we did try and set up with the idea of a different structure, organisational structure as well.
Yeah, I guess, having that sense of sustainability around the company, and I guess that longevity as well with it. And I didn't think we'd necessarily be here still 10 or 12 years down the line. I think we'd sort of said, okay, we'll give it a year and see what happens, because people were sort of showing an interest in the work that we'd done basically on a volunteer basis. It was just work that we wanted to make in our own time for fun. And I suppose that kind of sort of gained traction. And again, maybe lots of different things kind of coincided in terms of the landscape of marketing and people being very much interested in experiential events. So events that were very much about giving audiences an experience of a brand. And I think, you know, that is sort of where some of the work that we do for clients sort of sits within, often within marketing budgets, and isn't an extension of either an existing event that they have, and they want maybe a digital counterpart to a live event, or it might be a physical event to engage with a new audience that they're not necessarily engaging with there and then. So yeah, it's sort of, but ultimately everything I suppose that we are interested in doing is centred around story, centred around play, and then I think centred around that sense of giving people a different kind of experience that perhaps they haven't necessarily done. And then I suppose my frustration and my decision to leave performing and also almost detach from theatre, I think what was lacking for me, I was sort of longing for that something different. And I think playing games and having that embodied experience was really exciting. So how then you can take that emotion or take that feeling into something that perhaps has a bit more story or is a bit more hybrid in terms of the interactivity or that agency that I have the opportunity to maybe affect a part of the story or maybe interact with it somehow, I found quite exciting.
I think that play is probably like the big crossover there. I'm just thinking kind of about the difference in the journeys we've had then since we were at drama school together, really, which is kind of you saying that you fell out of love, I guess, with acting and theatre pretty quickly, and I stuck with that. But I think, you know, I was talking about the point when Lucy and I started making Gaggle Babble work, and I was very lucky that around about that time I began working with companies where play was absolutely at the heart of what they did. So, you know, I talked about Told by an Idiot, but Improbable, Spy Monkey, people like that who I guess are coming from a different perspective on how work is made, and that play is absolutely at the heart of that. Like, the play is the work that you're doing. Like, that is a part of the generating of the material, but also is what you're doing in front of an audience. So that had kind of reignited my interest in theatre, I think, massively. And then I think that's when I then fell into I'd moved back to Cardiff and fell into this kind of pool of people that seemed to me to be making work that came from that place of playing, which was just really enjoyable to both kind of make, but also to watch. I'm not sure if that's the right term, take part in, experience. So yeah, it definitely felt like there was a really exciting movement around that time that we were all kind of part of.
Are there projects or things you've been to see that you can kind of think back and go, that was kind of something that either was just memorable and that was kind of good, or things that were like, I have such a powerful urge to try and make something in that feel or something?
That's made me think of two things. So the first piece of theatre I ever saw was in the park in Biggar, just in the Scottish borders. My grandpa took me one summer, and this strangely dressed person approached us and tried to make me drink a green liquid that I knew was lime juice, and I knew I hated lime juice, so I absolutely refused to drink this liquid. I must have been about 4 or 5 at this time. I was not having any of that, and so they said, okay, we'll put a spell on you. And then off we went into the woods at the edge of Biggar Park and saw some like fairies and witches in the woods, and that absolutely blew my mind. Even though I had known that green liquid was lime juice and I was not going to drink that the sense of magic, kind of like awe and wonder, I mean, it was just completely magical. So that makes me think of that. And then I guess there are a couple of other things. So I grew up in Edinburgh, and I used to work. I was really lucky that from about the age of 16, every summer I would work front of house for Assembly Rooms, which are one of the Edinburgh Fringe festival venues, and one of the only ones that would pay you. It's kind of controversial topic around Edinburgh and payment around things, but yeah, back in the day they were definitely one of the only venues that would properly pay you. And so I every summer would work for 3.5-4 weeks in Assembly Rooms, and I was an usher. I would just watch anything and everything that was in that venue, whether it was good, bad, circus, stand-up, weird kind of experimental performance art, whatever it was, I watched it, and so I felt like I had this like amazing kind of like brain dump of stuff. And there were a couple of companies that I remember seeing. I remember seeing some early work from the team, which is Rachel Chavkin, and that felt really exciting. And then kind of, I guess, within the Fringe and the festival itself, I remember seeing a lot of gridiron work, which was site located. I remember going on a bus out to the Bouldering Centre to watch, again, another kind of going to the moon piece. I can't remember, that's slightly dismissing it. It was, brilliant going in and watching this thing in a site there. So I remember seeing lots of stuff around that time, kind of 16 to probably 20, 21. I did that every summer all the way through drama college, all kinds of things. And then I guess working with Wild Works 2 summers ago kind of absolutely blew my brain a little bit. So they're a landscape theatre company, and so they are thinking everything is uber filmic. Artistic director is a designer, theatre maker, kind of his first practice is design with Pharaoh. So they're always thinking in terms of imagery, but they're always also thinking about the community and the landscape that they're going into. So you have vistas that are huge. We were working on a beach, and you would have somebody approaching from a kilometre away down the beach, and you'd be waiting for that person to arrive. And then within that you've got the unpredictability. One night the moon was just enormous, and nobody looked at any of the things we wanted them to look at because there was this extraordinary moon which became the backdrop, or the teenagers that would hang out and get drunk on the beach became also the backdrop to the work. And you're making that piece with these things, not against them. They're kind of like you were talking about within watching stuff within Cardiff city centre. It's their landscape, it's their space as much as it's ours. So but that idea of landscape work, of really both curating and sitting within kind of existing landscapes, I got really, really excited by. Is that the end?
I think it might be.
Sorry, I was on mute.
You've been listening to Crafted Reality with me, Ali John, and Julian Sykes. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Please give us a like and share with anyone that you think might be interested. See you next time.